Welcome to NSG 411, Study Session 3, Functions or Components of Management, Planning, Introduction. In this study session, we will discuss the concepts of planning. We will also examine the purposes of planning as well as its characteristics. Again, we will list the three major types of organizational planning as well as the various phases involved. We will also analyze the classifications and elements of planning. To conclude, we will highlight and explain problems facing effective planning, as well as the policies and procedures of planning. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to examine the following: purpose and characteristics of planning, types and phases of planning, classification and elements of planning, problems facing effective planning, and policies and procedure of planning. Defining planning. Planning is the first function of management. All other management functions, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling depend on planning. The nurse manager needs to be familiar with the decision-making process and tools so that she can identify the purpose of the institution, state the philosophy, define goals and objectives, prepare budgets to implement her plans, and effectively manage her time and that of the organization. Definitions. Planning, a basic function of management. It is a principal duty of all managers within the division of nursing. It is a systematic process and requires knowledgeable activity based on sound managerial theory. Quants and Welrich define planning as selecting missions and objectives and the actions to achieve them. It requires decision-making, that is, choosing future courses of action from among alternatives. Purpose of planning. Generally, the missions or purpose or reasons for planning include to succeed in achieving goals and objectives, to give meaning to work, provides for effective utilization of available personnel and facilities, helps in coping with crisis situations. It is cost-effective. It is needed for effective control. It is based on past and future, thus helping to reduce the elements of change. It can be used to discover the need for change, satisfactory outcome of decisions, assurance of economy of time, space, and materials, highest use of personnel. Characteristics of planning. It is an interdependent process. It is future-oriented, forecasting integral, continuous process, intellectual process, integrating process. Planning and control are inseparable. Choice among alternative courses of action, flexible process. Types of planning. The major types of organizational plan include long-range or strategic planning, medium-range or tactical planning has a span of 6 to 12 months duration, short-range or operational planning. Phases or steps involved in planning. Phase 1. Assessment of the internal and external environment. The economic, demographic, technological, social, educational, and political factors are assessed in terms of their impact on opportunities and threats within the environment. Phase 2. Review of mission statement, philosophy, goals, and objectives. A mission statement reflects the purpose and direction of the healthcare agency or the department within it. A statement of philosophy provides direction for the agency and or department within it. Goals assist nurse administrators and other members of the healthcare team to focus attention on what is relevant and important and to develop strategies and actions to achieve the goals. The ability to write clear and concise objectives is an important aspect of nursing administration. Phase 3. Identification of strategies. This phase involves identifying major issues, establishing goals, and developing strategies to meet the goals. Strategy determines how the organization will go about attaining their vision. All departmental managers are involved in this process and are responsible for preparing a detailed plan of action which may involve the following: development of short and long-term objectives, formulation of annual department objectives, resource allocation, and preparation of the budget. Phase 4. Implementation. The specific plans for action are implemented in order of priority in this phase. This entails open communication with staff in regards to the priority for the next year and subsequent periods, formulation of revised policies and procedures in regard to changes, and formulation of area and individual objectives related to the plans. Phase 5. At set periods, the strategic plan is reviewed at all levels to determine if the goals, objectives, and activities are on target. Classification of planning. The various methods upon which planning has been classified and adopted by most early management writers include time horizon, comprehensiveness, the level, element of planning, written statements of mission or purpose, philosophy, objectives or goals, detailed management or operational plans, policies, procedures, standards, protocols, characteristic, activities. Influencing planning, timing, cost or money, manpower, adequate communication, commitment of members in the organization. Problems facing effective planning: no commitment, no clear objectives, poor communication when it is one-man decision that people are not carried along, lack of resources, man, material, and money, unrealistic in terms of cost, time, and resources, or when cost is not enough. So he who fails to plan plans to fail. The time lag between setting of objectives and implementing the plan. Policies and procedures. A policy is a statement of a mandatory course or method established by Saskatchewan One Health that regional health authorities and healthcare organizations must comply with in their operations and decision-making. Policies can be to interpret or clarify legislative provisions where further clarification or a description of process is necessary, or define those matters which are supplementary to specific legislation and are part of the ministry's mandate. It is important to differentiate policy from those items which can be categorized as procedures, guidelines, or general information. Planning must reflect the policies of an organization. Policy is typically described as a principle or rule to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. It contains the what and the why. Policies are generally adopted by the board of or senior governance body within an organization. A policy can be considered as a statement of intent or a commitment. For that reason, at least, we can be held accountable for our policy. The term policy may apply to government, private sector organizations, and groups and individuals. Policy differs from rules or law. While law can compel or prohibit behaviors, policy merely guides actions towards those that are most likely to achieve a desired outcome. Policy may also refer to the process of making important organizational decisions, including the alternatives such as programs or spending priorities, and choosing among them on the basis of impact they will have. It provides the framework within which decision makers are expected to operate while making organizational decisions. They are the basic guides to be consistent in decision making. A procedure is a series of steps to be followed or particular actions to implement to perform a function and may comply with policy or guidelines. A guideline is a statement or other explanation by which to set standards or determine a course of action. The guidelines may or may not be required to be followed in order to comply with policy. A policy is a formal statement of a principle or rule that members of an organization must follow. Each policy addresses an issue important to the organization's mission or operations. A procedure tells members of the organization how to carry out or implement a policy. Policy is the what and the procedure is the how-to. Policies are written as statements or rules. Procedures are written as instructions in logical steps. Steps in policy development. Typically, policy development will follow the following steps. Step 1. Establish need for a policy. Step 2. Develop policy content. Step 3. Draft the policy. Step 4. Write the procedure. Step 5. Review of the policy by key parties. Step 6. Approve the policy. Step 7. Implement the policy. Step 8. Policy review and update. Step 9. Communication of changes to the policy. Policy sections. Purpose, scope, statements, responsibilities, definitions, questions, references, effective date, review date, and approval. Decision making. This can be regarded as the cognitive process resulting in the selection of a belief or a course of action among several alternative possibilities. Every decision-making process produces a final choice that may or may not prompt action. Decision-making is the study of identifying and choosing alternatives based on the values and preferences of the decision maker. Decision-making is one of the central activities of management and is a huge part of any process of implementation. For effective decision-making, objectives must first be established. Objectives must be classified and placed in order of importance. Alternative actions must be developed. The alternative must be evaluated against all the objectives. The alternative that is able to achieve all the objectives is the tentative decision. The tentative decision is evaluated for more possible consequences. The decisive actions are taken, and additional actions are taken to prevent any adverse consequences from becoming problems and starting both systems, problem analysis, and decision making all over again. There are steps that are generally followed that result in a decision model that can be used to determine an optional production plan. In a situation featuring conflict, role-playing may be helpful for predicting decisions to be made by involved parties. Decision-making steps. Each step in the decision-making process may include social, cognitive, and cultural obstacles to successfully negotiating dilemmas. It has been suggested that becoming more aware of these obstacles allows one to better anticipate and overcome them. The Arkansas program presents 8 stages of moral decision making based on the work of James Rest. Establishing community, creating and nurturing the relationships, norms, and procedures that will influence how problems are understood and communicated. This stage takes place prior to and during a moral dilemma. Perception, recognizing that a problem exists. Interpretation, identifying competing explanations for the problem and evaluating the drivers behind those interpretations. Judgment, sifting through various possible actions or responses and determining which is more justifiable. Motivation, examining the competing commitments which may distract from a more moral course of action, and then prioritizing and committing to moral values over other personal, institutional, or social values. Action, following through with action that supports the more justified decision. Integrity is supported by the ability to overcome distractions and obstacles, developing, implementing skills, and ego strength. Reflection in action. Reflection on action. Decision-making model. There are 7 steps in effective decision-making. Step 1. Identify the decision to be made. You realize that a decision must be made. You then go through an internal process of trying to define clearly the nature of the decision you must make. This first step is a very important one. Step 2. Gather relevant information. Most decisions require collecting pertinent information. The real trick in this step is to know what information is needed, the best sources of this information, and how to go about getting it. Some information must be sought from within you through a process of self-assessment. Other information must be sought from outside yourself, from books, people, and a variety of other sources. This step, therefore, involves both internal and external work. Step 3. Identify alternatives. Through the process of collecting information, you will probably identify several possible paths of action or alternatives. You may also use your imagination and information to construct new alternatives. In this step of the decision-making process, you will list all possible and desirable alternatives. Step 4. Weigh evidence. In this step, you draw on your information and emotions to imagine what it would be like if you carried out each of the alternatives to the end. You must evaluate whether the need identified in step 1 would be helped or solved through the use of each alternative. In going through this difficult internal process, you begin to favor certain alternatives which appear to have higher potential for reaching your goal. Eventually, you are able to place the alternatives in priority order based upon your own value system. Step 5. Choose among alternatives. Once you have weighed all the evidence, you are ready to select the alternative which seems to be best suited to you. You may even choose a combination of alternatives. Your choice in step 5 may very likely be the same or similar to the alternative you placed at the top of your list at the end of step 4. Step 6. Take action. You now take some positive action which begins to implement the alternative you chose in step 5. Step 7. Review decision and consequences. In the last step, you experience the result of your decision and evaluate whether or not it has solved the need you identified in step 1. If it has, you may stay with this decision for some period of time. If the decision has not resolved the identified need, you may repeat certain steps of the process in order to make a new decision. You may, for example, gather more detailed or somewhat different information or discover additional alternatives on which to base your decision. Kinds of decisions. There are several basic kinds of decisions. 1. Decisions whether. This is the yes or no, either or decision that must be made before we proceed with the selection of an alternative. Should I buy a new TV? Should I travel this summer? Decisions whether are made by weighing reasons pro and con. A simple worksheet with 2 columns, one for pro reasons for and one with con reasons against, can be useful for this kind of decision. It is important to be aware of having made a decision whether, since too often we assume that decision making begins with the identification of alternatives, assuming that the decision to choose one has already been made. 2. Decisions which. These decisions involve a choice of one or more alternatives from among a set of possibilities, the choice being based on how well each alternative measures up to a set of predefined criteria. 3. Contingent decisions. These are decisions that have been made but put on hold until some condition is met. Most people carry around a set of already made contingent decisions, just waiting for the right conditions or opportunity to arise. Time, energy, price, availability, opportunity, encouragement. All these factors can figure into the necessary conditions that need to be met before we can act on our decision. Some contingent decisions are unstated or even exist below the awareness of the decision maker. These are the types that occur when we seize opportunity. The best contingent and opportunistic decisions are made by the prepared mind, one that has thought about criteria and alternatives in the past. 4. Contingent alternatives. Similar to contingent decisions, contingent alternatives involve 2 or more choices of action, one of which will be taken when the appropriate trigger occurs. Often, this trigger is an event or more information. Concept of power in organization. There are times when one's attempts to influence others are overwhelmed by other forces or individuals. Where does this power come from? Who has it? Who does it? In the earlier section or hierarchy, it was noted that although people at the top of the hierarchy have most of the authority in the organization, they do not have all of the power. In fact, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy also have some sources of power. This section explains how this can be true. First, power is defined, and then the sources of power available to people on the lower rungs of the ladder are considered. Using power, one person or group can impose its will on another person or group. The use of power can be positive, as when the nurse manager gives a staff member an extra day off in exchange for working during the weekend, or negative, as when a nurse administrator transfers a bothersome staff nurse to another unit after the staff nurse pointed out a physician error. Sources of power. There are numerous sources of power. Many of them are readily available to nurses, but some of them are not. The following include sources of power. Authority. The power granted to an individual or a group by virtue of position within the organizational hierarchy. For example, reward. The promise of money, goods, services, recognition, or other benefits. Expertise. the special knowledge an individual is believed to possess. As Sir Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. Study session summary. In this study session, we discuss the concepts of planning. We also examine the purposes of planning as well as its characteristics. Again, we listed the 3 major types of organizational planning as well as the various phases involved. End of study session 3.